This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amreliwala. On today's Global, the devastating volcanic eruption and tsunami that's hit Tonga. A huge ash cloud has engulfed the Pacific Islands. One official said the island nation looks like a moonscape. The volcano erupted underwater. Satellite images suggest some areas have been completely submerged. The shockwaves were so powerful they were felt from Tonga to the US.
The most pressing concern would be the water, as a lot of Tongans collected rainwater in their tanks and boiled them for drinking water, but that has been contaminated by the ash.
With communications cut off, we'll try to find out what is happening on the ground. Also on the programme, Novak Djokovic arrives back in Serbia after being deported from Australia. Now his defence of the French Open is also in doubt. Arrests in England in connection with the siege at a Texas synagogue after a British man held 4 people captive. The rabbi says he was praying when he realised what was going on.
I heard a click, and it could have been anything, and it turned out that it was his gun.
And MPs return to Westminster with the British Prime Minister still under huge pressure over allegations of parties and drinking at Downing Street during COVID lockdowns. Hello and welcome to today's Global, and we start with the volcanic eruption and tsunami in Tonga, where a communications blackout means the scale of the destruction still remains unclear. The volcano erupted underwater on Saturday, triggering waves of over a metre high. Well, Tonga is a nation of more than 170 South Pacific islands, about 2,000 kilometres from New Zealand. It has a population of around 100,000. The Red Cross estimates that about 80% of them may have been affected. Satellite pictures of the eruption are some of the few images that we have. There are reports of missing people and fears that low-lying villages have been swept away. The thick cloud of ash from the volcano has prevented planes from coming too close or landing, but emergency supplies are being airdropped by military planes from Australia and also New Zealand. Our Philippines correspondent Howard Johnson has sent this report.
A military surveillance plane leaving Auckland, New Zealand this morning, bound for Tonga. Australia has also sent planes to carry out an assessment of the damage caused by Saturday's eruption of an underwater volcano. Satellite images captured the moment a tsunami triggered by the eruption engulfed Tonga and sent a shockwave across the Pacific Ocean. And listen to this, a sonic boom captured on video more than 400 miles away in Fiji. The International Federation of the Red Cross estimate that more than 80,000 people have been affected by the eruption.
The last communication that we received was straight after the eruption, and then it's a total cutoff. Right now, we are trying our best through our satellite phones, but they haven't picked up any signals.
Britain Angela Glover was last seen by her husband clinging to a tree before she was swept away by the tsunami. The family have put a number of posts on social media appealing for information. She moved to Tonga in 2015, leaving behind an advertising job to start an animal shelter where she looks after and houses stray dogs and is a popular figure on the island.
The local authorities have been conducting searches, and I believe that they're still ongoing, although, it's daytime there. So, look, it's 48 hours. I'm not holding out much hope.
Communications to Tonga remain badly affected. The not knowing of what happened to loved ones is creating unbearable concern. Howard Johnson, BBC News, Manila.
Well, let's speak now to David Pyle. He's a volcanologist at the University of Oxford. David, welcome here to the programme. Let's start with the size and scale of this eruption. It is quite something, isn't it?
Yes, this is a very significant eruption. As you were saying, we can see from the weather satellite imagery, that the ash cloud developed very quickly and rapidly had a diameter in excess of hundreds of kilometres. This is a really very significant eruption.
Now, in terms of the satellite images, the data, what are you able to learn from that?
So the weather satellites give an indication of where the ash cloud is, and the speed at which that cloud developed gives a sense of how strong the eruption is. Information you can extract from the satellites also tells you how high the ash plume rose, and there's a suggestion that the material erupted out of the volcano might have reached as high as 30 kilometers in the atmosphere before spreading sideways. And other satellite images allow you to detect the presence of volcanic gases. In particular, the most important volcanic gas that you can detect from satellite is sulfur dioxide. And that's another indication of the size of the eruption.
What does that going into the atmosphere, both ash and the various chemicals, what does that actually do? What is the impact of that?
So the sulfur dioxide, the amount of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, it looks as though it's about, it's less than 1 million tons of sulfur dioxide. So it's not of the scale of the eruption, let's say, of Mount Pinatubo. So the main impacts are probably from the volcanic ash. So this is finely pulverized rock, which will fall out of the ash cloud onto the surface below. There's a lot of water involved in the eruption because it's a submarine volcano. So I'd have thought there's a significant chance of considerable disruption on the ground, either from falling of ash or ash with rain, so muddy rain. And of course, complete disruption to lives, communications over a vast area.
And that is likely to be that way for a number of weeks, it is being suggested. In terms of that underwater eruption, how unusual is that? And what is the impact, the fact it happened underwater, the depth of it, on the tsunami that it triggered?
Yes, so there are many underwater volcanoes, but this, in terms of scale, this is probably the largest underwater volcano eruption that we've seen for the last few decades. There was a similar sort of eruption at Krakatoa about 3 years ago. But the presence of water, a small amount of water and lots of hot rock means that you get much more violent explosions. The water is rapidly converted to steam as it comes into contact with the magma. It shatters the volcanic rocks, so it produces much more fine ash material, but also the steam expansion drives the explosion itself. So it's a really very violent eruption.
And from more of the satellite imagery, we've seen large areas, especially on the western coast of the main island, looking like they've been submerged. Are you able to have any sort of guess in terms of scale of damage from a tsunami of this size and the likelihood of any more eruptions?
So it's clear from the detections that we've seen is that this was a really very considerable tsunami that was triggered from the eruption that ran across the whole of the Pacific basin. And it doesn't take much of a tsunami wave to have devastating impacts on low-lying areas of the islands. So that's really, that's going to be really difficult to cope with, I imagine. Sorry, I forgot the second part of the question.
Just in terms, very briefly, in terms of whether we're likely to see further eruptions.
So volcanoes of this scale, it's likely that this is the main phase of the eruption that's just happened. The volcano had been erupting since December. It's unlikely that this is the end of this particular eruption sequence, but without any way of being able to detect what's going on with the volcano, that's going to become very hard to diagnose.
David, we have to leave it there, but David Powell from Oxford University, thanks so much for joining us on the programme and explaining so much of what we've seen going on in the last couple of days.
Thank you.
Now, France has announced that athletes wishing to compete in international sporting competitions taking place there must be vaccinated against COVID-19. It means that the world #1 tennis star Novak Djokovic faces the prospect of being denied entry to the French Open in May. It comes as Djokovic arrived back in the Serbian capital Belgrade after losing that visa battle that centred on the fact that he is unvaccinated, leading to his deportation. Well, our Balkans correspondent Guy Delorney is in Belgrade, and in terms of what Novak Djokovic has said and the reception he got, take me through what it's been like since he's returned.
Well, his return was really quite low-key in the end. We did have a few dozen supporters who turned up at the airport to greet him, but this wasn't the normal return in triumph. It was return after a comprehensive defeat at the hands of the Australian judicial and also political systems. So it wasn't the kind of return that Novak Djokovic is used to at all. And although there were a small number of supporters at the airport to greet him, Novak Djokovic didn't actually see them. He ended up going out through the diplomatic channel in Belgrade airport and out through an entrance that nobody was waiting at all, really. And so the fans who had come to see him and wanted to shout their support and tell them that they still loved him didn't get the chance to do so. And Novak Djokovic apparently went off in a car with his brother Georgia. He said, this is Novak, that he won't be commenting again until after the end of the Australian Open Tennis Championships. He doesn't want to be a disruption anymore and wants people to enjoy that spectacle of sport, is the implication. His family have also said they won't be commenting either, though they have been strong supporters of Novak Djokovic during this entire affair, as have the political leaders in Serbia as well. I think now it's going to be a chance for everybody to settle down, take a few days of rest and recuperation, and then think about what happens to the world's top male tennis player going forward.
Guy Delorney, thanks very much, Guy Delorney there in Belgrade for us. So from tennis to the Premier League to the NFL, there have been controversies surrounding vaccination in sport and the question of whether it should be mandatory in order to compete in international competitions. Well, that has become a really divisive issue. Let's talk to Jonathan Liu, who's sports writer at The Guardian newspaper now. Jonathan, welcome here to the programme. Let's start with the Djokovic saga. It is now over. Your assessment of the damage done?
Yeah, well, it has turned quite toxic and quite rancorous and really a regrettable situation for all involved. I mean, Djokovic had opportunities at plenty of stages in this process to kind of de-escalate. He could have chosen to get vaccinated like 97% of the other male tennis players at the tournament, or when he was denied entry to Australia initially, he could have chosen to leave the country, or he could have chosen not to travel in the first place, given his kind of anti-vaccine stance. But the fact that he kind of chose to fight it and not helped, it has to be said, by a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the Australian government, has turned this into, well, as Djokovic's coach Boris Becker put it, a case with no winners.
And looking forward, I touched on it in the introduction, it is looking like at the French Open he may not be able to go to that event either, with the rules likely to be in place at the time in May and June. I suppose, again, it will be decision time for the player himself. Exactly.
And, there are, I think there's a growing intolerance in a lot of societies around the world to unvaccinated people. And, Djokovic has a very high-profile anti-vaxxer, you have to say. He's going to have a decision to make. He's essentially going to have to choose between his career and his pursuit of a 21st Grand Slam title, or his beliefs, which he clearly holds very sincerely and quite strongly. But he is going to find life a lot harder for him if he continues to take this stance.
And I mentioned in the introduction, it is not just tennis. We've seen in football over the last few months, Joshua Kimmich in the Bundesliga. We knew that a couple of months ago, I think it was only 65% of Premier League footballers had been fully vaccinated. You have the NFL, you have the NBA, all grappling with the same issue. I mean, this is something that all sports are having to actually consider and take a position on.
Yeah, and the important thing to note is that vaccine skepticism amongst athletes was pretty high when vaccines were first available, and that has really come down quite strongly. There's been a real education drive in a lot of sports, tennis, football, American football, to essentially educate people, kind of show them what their kind of responsibilities are, and vaccine take up amongst especially younger athletes has been very encouraging, which only leaves, I guess, the few remaining holdouts. There's high-profile names like Djokovic or Kyrie Irving in the NBA are only going to be more isolated in future if the majority of their peers have chosen to get vaccinated and they continue to hold out.
A quick final thought. The Winter Olympics is the next big sporting event, very tight controls around that. Do you think more could be done by the sporting bodies? So you have Wimbledon also coming up in the summer, and it seems that different countries have their different rules. Would it be better if individual sporting organisations had sort of a blanket policy on these things?
No, it's possible, but you do have to you do have local laws, and every country will have its own, I guess, customs and approach to this matter. But what individual sports can do mostly is educate and instead of kind of throwing around bans, just essentially encouraging players and athletes to get vaccinated and kind of showing them what the costs, not just to their reputation, but to their career will be if they continue to resist vaccination.
Jonathan, we're out of time, but thanks so much for your time and joining us on the programme. Thanks so much. Well, do stay with us, because later in the programme we'll talk to the former tennis great Pam Shriver, her views on where this leaves tennis and the wider issues around sporting stars and vaccination. That's a little later here on today's Global. Well, do stay with us, because in a moment on the programme I'll be getting the latest from our UK political correspondent as the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson remains under pressure over his handling of Downing Street parties during the lockdowns.
Of all the companies on the Fortune 500 in the year 2000, more than half no longer exist. Digital transformation isn't just a good idea, it's a matter of corporate survival. Enterprise AI enables organizations to use artificial intelligence at enterprise scale, solving previously unsolvable business problems to help you not just survive, but thrive. C3 AI. This is Enterprise AI.
Welcome back to today's Global on BBC World News. Our main story here: aid efforts to the tsunami-hit islands in Tonga have been gathering pace as further information comes in of the damage assessment from teams there on the ground. Now, MPs are returning to Westminster today, with the British Prime Minister still under huge pressure over allegations of parties and drinking at Downing Street during COVID lockdowns. 6 Conservative MPs have now called on Boris Johnson to resign. The government, though, is making a series of policy announcements amid talk of a fight back, including an announcement about the future funding of the BBC. Well, with me here in the studio is our political correspondent, Rob Watson. I'll come to the BBC in a moment, Rob, but MPs returning from their constituencies, listening to their constituents over the weekend, that is always, in a situation like this, always a slightly dangerous moment, isn't it?
I think I'd say a bit more than slightly dangerous, potentially terminal. And let me paint a picture for you. There is literally in Parliament a tea room, right, where the MPs gather to gossip. I've never been allowed in because I'm not an MP, but I can see it through the doors. And you can imagine the real danger for the Prime Minister, and I know this from the MPs who attend us, that they gather there and say, what did you hear? How bad was it from your constituents? I mean, of course, it's possible that some of the MPs might say, well, actually, it wasn't quite as bad as I expected. But that is the danger, that your MPs, they come back, they're in that tea room or on WhatsApp saying, goodness gracious, things look bad, don't they, mate?
And whilst we wait for more opinion to coalesce, for more details to emerge, now we have a whole series of policy announcements being rolled out. I mentioned the BBC, but there are others. What is going on here?
So, on the face of it, there's a kind of a lull in the story, right? But don't be fooled by that. The storm hasn't passed over. And Downing Street, the Prime Minister, is fighting for his life, right? I mean, this is a guy who fights for his life. So he's out there lobbying in private behind the scenes, saying to MPs, hold your nerve, hold your nerve. He's also promising to have a clear out of Downing Street. There won't be any of that drinking culture. Lots of people are going to get the sack. And then there's the bit that's really out in public, which is what you're talking about, the sort of policies, the kind of things that that he hopes will appeal to the right wing of his governing Conservative party. So things like having a little bit of a bash at the BBC over its funding, and of course the idea that you would somehow get Britain's armed forces involved in policing the waters between the UK and France and picking up migrants.
We're waiting for that announcement on the BBC. It's expected in the House of Commons, I think, in the next 15 minutes. So we'll bring you that when it comes in, because that is likely to be quite significant around future funding. But returning to all those allegations around parties, the investigations, the Sue Gray report. Reports last week that she had been blindsided by yet another party that was reported in the papers, and that's where she first heard about it. So when is that Sue Gray report likely to actually land?
I've spent much of the last couple of hours trying to find out, me and every other journalist in Westminster. We don't know. We think sometime either towards the end of this week or the beginning of next week. And what's really interesting about it is, if you like, it's the next sort of stage post in this kind of crisis for Boris Johnson. He survived last week. He managed to persuade MPs, please give me a chance until this report comes out. So it's when that report comes out is the next time that we all gather around and say, OK, does he survive that?
All right, Rob Watson, for now, thanks very much. Thank you. Now, 2 teenagers have been arrested in Manchester after a British man took 4 people hostage in a synagogue in Texas on Saturday. 44-year-old Malik Faisal Akram from Blackburn was shot dead by police after a 10-hour standoff in Dallas. The 4 hostages, who included a rabbi, were unharmed. Greater Manchester Police said the teenagers were arrested as part of the ongoing investigation into the attack. Here's our correspondent, Sophie Long.
This is the moment the 3 final hostages ran for their lives, more than 10 hours after their ordeal began. A successful but nonetheless terrifying end to the delicate day-long operation involving negotiators and heavily armed police. The man, now identified as Malik Faisal Akram, a 44-year-old British citizen originally from Lancashire, was shot and killed. He'd claimed to have a gun and a bomb when he interrupted a peaceful morning service being streamed from the congregation Beth Israel in Dallas.
I'm going to die at the end of this, all right? Are you listening? I am going to die.
It didn't look good. It didn't sound good. We were terrified. And when I saw an opportunity where he wasn't in a good position, I made sure that the 2 gentlemen who were still with me, that they were ready to go. The exit wasn't too far away. I told them to go. I threw a chair at the gunman, and I headed for the door. And all 3 of us were able to get out without even a shot being fired.
Akram, who arrived in the United States 2 weeks ago, was heard ranting about religion and demanding the release of a Pakistani neuroscientist with suspected links to Al-Qaeda currently serving a prison sentence in Texas. People came here, a place of worship, to pray. But once again in America, a moment of peace became a moment of profound pain. As the people who were trapped, terrified, tried to come to terms with what happened, synagogues across the country have increased security in fear of copycat attacks.
This was an act of terror. This is an act of terror. We're not going to tolerate this, that we have this capacity to deal with assaults on particularly the anti-Semitism that has grown up. And so, and I'll be talking with, I put a call into the rabbi. We missed one another on the way up here. But they should rest assured that we are focused.
As soon as it became known that Akram was a British citizen, the investigation became global. Counter-terror police in Manchester are assisting the US authorities and are now questioning 2 teenagers who were arrested in the city last night. Sophie Long, BBC News, Dallas.
Well, let's stay in America because eastern parts of the US and also Canada have been struck by major winter storms, with states as far south as Georgia and South Carolina among those declaring states of emergency. More than 30 centimetres of snow is forecast for some areas. You can see here how Washington has been affected and thousands of flights have been cancelled. Well, the snow and ice made for tricky driving conditions in North Carolina. Across the region, tens of thousands of homes were left without power. Further south, with higher temperatures, flooding was the problem caused by heavy rains. You can see here how the roads in Norfolk and Virginia were left covered by the rising waters. And even in states where temperatures stayed above freezing, like Florida, there were issues with damage from tornadoes. More than 60 homes were left uninhabitable. Well, BBC Weather's Sarah Keith Lucas has more.
A winter storm has been bringing some pretty disruptive weather to the eastern United States over the past 24 hours or so. We've had about 145,000 people without power, as well as more than 3,000 flights cancelled, all down to this area of low pressure. It brought 15.5 inches of snowfall to Flat Rock in North Carolina, and it's going to be continuing its progress northwards through Monday and on into Tuesday. Some very heavy snowfall to come for New York State. There could be about 20 inches, 50 centimetres falling there towards New England, into Quebec as well. Eventually that system will clear off towards Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, where it'll be bringing some heavy rain, but some brisk winds along with that snowfall as well. And then the next area of snow moves from the prairies across the Great Lakes towards the northeastern United States into Wednesday as well. So we're not quite out of the woods yet. More disruptive weather on the cards over the next few days. It's that mix of heavy snow, blowing snow with gales as well, bringing reduced visibility, and ice accumulations may well lead to further disruption to transport and to power too.
Well, after the break, we'll have the latest on Tonga with UNICEF here live on the programme. Don't go away.